think there's that Almodovar movie I saw years ago where they're all dead, but they don't actually know it, that they're undead. So like, I feel like I just stepped on stage, and it's like, is this one of those moments, like, am I still actually alive? I don't really know. So my name's Aditya, as Jason mentioned, and I'm here to talk to you all about alert fatigue. I'm here to talk to you about how alert fatigue affects us as engineers, how it affects healthcare clinicians in a clinical setting, and what we can learn from healthcare in order to make our lives as engineers more manageable, to improve our on-call rotations and also our daily work. How many of you all are from California? It's a lot of people. All right, keep your hands up. How many of you have visited California any time in the last 30 years since Prop 65 was passed? Yep. So if you've ever so much as been to California, if you even just take a flight to SFO, the first thing that you will see when you step off the plane onto the jet bridge is a sign that says something like this. This area contains chemicals known to the state of California to cause cancer, birth defects, and other reproductive harm. You can't miss them. They're absolutely everywhere. And ostensibly, you know, they're a form of alerts. They're there to notify the public about potential toxins that they might be interacting with on, you know, in their daily lives. But the Prop 65 warnings have also been criticized for not actually serving their intended purpose and for being ineffective. And we'll look at them, we'll learn some ways to talk about alert fatigue, and we'll actually look at them and see how, through the lens of alert fatigue, why specifically they're criticized and what, you know, what maybe we could do to make them better. Now, fortunately, there is a field where there's a whole body of peer-reviewed published research on the topic of alert fatigue, and that's in healthcare, clinical healthcare. When I say healthcare, I mean specifically like an inpatient or outpatient practice, like a hospital, and where a doctor or a nurse, someone is providing medical care to a patient. And there are a lot of differences between software engineering and healthcare, but they actually serve in many ways to encourage better practices that we might learn from. They serve as a forcing function for healthcare to do things which we otherwise, might not necessarily think to. In healthcare, there's a lot of direct personal contact with, with the people that you're impacting, and it's very visibly high stakes. There's a lot of emotional investment because you're directly dealing with the patient's life, and the systems are very difficult to control. For all the advances we have in modern medicine, we still have, just a fraction of the degree of control over the human body that, as engineers, we all have over the systems that we have built from scratch ourselves. So what I'm going to do is I'll distill some of the lessons from all of this research that's been published over the years in healthcare and see how we can apply them to software. Now, alert fatigue and decision fatigue are terms which we might use on a daily basis in casual conversation, but without necessarily understanding the formal relationship that exists between them. Alert fatigue is what happens when the frequency or the severity of alerts causes the responder either to ignore important alerts or to make mistakes more frequently. Now, note that I don't actually talk about false positives here in this definition. Oftentimes we conflate those two conversations, but alert fatigue can happen even if there are no false positives. Just if the sheer number of alerts, the sheer volume or severity becomes overwhelming and becomes taxing, that can still be a fatiguing alerting system. And that fatigue happens because our resources are limited, specifically our executive functioning skills. Executive functioning is a set of skills in psychology that's used to, it's a term that's used to talk about a set of related skills like time management, organization, decision making, anything which requires basically taking a thought or an intention and actually putting that into practice in a structured and ordered form, those are your executive functioning skills. And we have, again, a large body of research into how executive functioning works, and we found that, among other things, executive function is actually limited. Over any given period of time, your executive functioning ability is limited. It can get depleted. And it does replenish over time, but again, it's not infinite. And that's important because that's how we end up with alert fatigue, is because we've depleted our executive functioning resources. Decision fatigue is similar as well. But decision fatigue is what happens when the frequency or the complexity of decision points that we have causes a person to avoid decisions or to make mistakes more frequently. And again, you'll notice that the definition, they're very similar, but really fundamentally what's happening is, again, a depletion of resources, our executive functioning skills. So this talk is about alert fatigue, but we have to think about decision fatigue as well because they're linked very intimately because they're competing for the same pool of resources, so we can't talk about one without also talking about the other. But there's also another reason that we have to talk about alert fatigue and decision fatigue at the same time. And it's very relevant to the theme of this conference. You see, alert fatigue is a question about the observability of systems. It's a matter of it's a question of how do we understand the internal states of our systems and how do we notify ourselves of that information in a timely and appropriate manner on a push basis. But it's just dealing with how well do we understand it. It's not talking about what do we actually do with that knowledge? And what we do with that knowledge, that's about the controllability of our systems. How do we operate it? How do we put them into practice? What do we do to actually fix things? You'll notice that this is a talk, Monitorama, this is a conference which is ostensibly about more the observability side of things. But still, you'll see a lot of talks that are about operations or factor that in because it doesn't make sense for us to talk about all the data that we observe if we're not going to think about how we actually would put that into practice and make it useful. And so alert fatigue and decision fatigue are related as well because it deals with the fundamental relationship between what are we observing and how do we observe it, and then our ability to actually effect change with it. Now, we've learned a lot of things from healthcare research. I want to call out a couple of interesting and relevant data points in particular. We found that anywhere from 72 to 99% of clinical alarms are false positives. Think about that number for a moment. That means that for every 100 times you get paged and your day is interrupted, only one of them actually resulted in an action that you needed to take. That's a terrible ratio. Does anyone have an on-call rotation that's like that, where up to 99%? I see one person raising their hands, and I feel so sorry for you. I mean, genuinely, that does not sound like that sounds very exhausting and taxing. But interestingly, even though the sheer number of alerts and false positives sounds overwhelming, that's actually not the primary driver of alert fatigue in a clinical setting. There are certain patterns of decisions and alerts that actually contribute disproportionately to this fatigue. Specifically, if you receive multiple false positives for that same patient, for a single patient over and over again, that actually contributes much more to alert fatigue than just the same number of false positives distributed across multiple patients. In that, we have to be careful here. It doesn't just induce alert fatigue for that one patient, but it actually contributes disproportionately to alert fatigue systemically across the entire system for all patients. So for us as software engineers, what does that mean? Well, if we want to actually work on improving our systems, designing alerting systems that are less fatiguing, we can't just say, well, that particular alert, we know that's a pathological, that's an edge case. We don't have to worry about it. We can kind of just ignore it and deal with the others. No, we need to actually go out of our way, actively chase down and track down those edge cases that are generating a disproportionate number of alerts, because more likely than not, those are actually going to be the primary drivers of alert fatigue within our systems. The things that will contribute to us, missing alerts, taking the wrong decisions, or just, honestly, just getting drained ourselves in responding to them, the things that drain our executive function. So using the results of the research on alert fatigue in a clinical setting, I'm going to borrow another technique from healthcare and introduce a rapid diagnostic test that we can use to identify the parts of our alerting systems that we need to focus on if we want to reduce alert fatigue and decision fatigue. There are 4 steps of this in this test. They're easy to remember because they'll form the acronym STAT as a mnemonic: supported, trustworthy, actionable, and triaged. Now, the point of a rapid diagnostic test in a clinical setting, it's not to answer all the questions for us. It's to help us identify the places where we need to ask more questions. It's to help us generate those other questions that we need to ask ourselves in order to improve the state of our systems. And so some of the principles here in STAT might sound obvious at first glance, but the implications are not. The important part is where they lead us, what they actually enable us to do with our systems. So the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, are our systems supported? Are our alerts supported? Who owns this monitor? Who has the right or the authority to make changes to our alerting rule set? And in STAT, we ask ourselves whether our monitors and our alerts are supported first because it reminds us of a very important principle. It reminds us that our alerting systems aren't just the software and the rule sets that we use for defining the alerts and bringing them to our attention, but it also includes, the alerting system also includes the people who participate in responding to our alerts. They are fundamentally part of the semantics of our alerting system. And an alerting system isn't just the software, it's also how you respond, it's the actions you take, it's the entire process. And when we look at our alerting systems in that light and ask ourselves, are they supported, it actually becomes really easy then to answer the question of, well, who actually does or should have the right or the authority to make changes to these alerts? Because we realize that the person who responds to an alert always has that right to change it, whether we realize it or acknowledge it or not, because they can always just decide to ignore the alert. And right then, you've suddenly changed the semantics of your alerting system, but you've done so in a way that's completely undocumented, completely opaque, completely not visible to anyone else on your team. So it's much better to have to empower people to change thresholds or rule sets explicitly than to make a conscious or an unconscious decision on an individual level to start ignoring it or responding differently to it. So for that reason, nobody on your team should feel any hesitation when adjusting the thresholds or changing, tweaking the rule set for generating alerts, within appropriate reason, because if we're allowing people to do this, if we give them that permission, we're not actually granting them any new power that they didn't already have. They already had the power to change the semantics of our alerting system because they're participating in the response. The trick is that we need to empower them in a way that allows us to encourage people collectively to design healthy systems for alerting. And there's a trick that we can do here for designing healthy alerting systems. The person who's responding to a monitor needs to feel the sense of ownership over the end result, not just that particular alert itself. And it's not a question of, well, does this alert fire at the end of the day or not? No, it's the actual metric that you care about. It might be the SLA for your service. It might be your uptime. It might actually be just directly your revenue. Depending on the situation, those could all be the true end results, the real collective goal that you're all sharing. If everyone who's responding to alerts feels a sense of ownership over the end result, and if their effects are sufficiently documented and transparent, so you have documentation for your monitors and what they should look like, and you have a change log or some way for people to see who's doing what, then that ownership is going to guide everyone on the team collectively to do the right thing because there is a shared buy-in, a collective set of values for the end result. And we do this because the best way to solve a problem may ultimately have absolutely nothing to do with alerting. We might say that, well, we don't actually need an alert here to solve the problem. What we really need to do is fix some underlying other problem within our architecture, and then we can get rid of the need for involving a human at all. And so if you have just like a special cabal of people or individuals who are empowered to make changes to alerts, and that's their domain, then, well, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so you're going to end up solving problems by adding alerts or by keeping alerts around long after they've served their intended utility. And if our goal is to reduce alert fatigue, well, that's going to run completely counter to that because we're actually creating a system where we're biasing towards having alerts as the solution to problem instead of trying to minimize that and trying to minimize that drain on our executive functioning skills. Now, this is something that's much easier for us to do as software engineers than it would be in healthcare because there are obviously safety and clinical and ethical concerns with having just a doctor or nurse unilaterally changing clinical thresholds for vital signs for a single patient. But because of the nature of our work, we have a little bit more leeway with how we can deal with problems like these. So let's take advantage of that and actually empower people to make the decisions that they need in order to design the alerting systems that are going to be the most effective for their work. The second step in STAT is, the T is trustworthy. We need to know that our alerting systems are going to notify us when a problem happens. We need to have faith in that. We need to trust it. We also need to trust that they're going to stay silent when there aren't any problems. And we need to trust that they're going to give us sufficient information, if they do fire, to actually diagnose and take action on the problem. Now, this trust operates at a systemic level. It's not just at the level of the individual monitor that generates alerts or the individual rule set. And trustworthiness is the most common places is the most common place where alerting systems can break down. And again, alerting systems include the teams that respond to the alerts. Because what you'll get is a slow erosion of trust in the entire process. People don't trust that this alert will actually notify us at an appropriate time, so we need to build some other hack. We don't trust that this alert is going to tell us the right things to do, so now we need to involve another person in the process. If we don't trust our alerts, then that means that we're not going to end up trusting each other. And if we don't trust each other, we're not going to be trusting ourselves. And that's a recipe for a completely failed alerting system. I want to take just a brief second and talk about a topic which I know a lot of people probably have questions about, which is how to use things like anomaly detection and other opaque algorithms for defining rule sets instead of just more traditional threshold-based alerts. Now, I'm a statistician actually by training, so you're never going to hear me make an argument that there isn't value to be made in applying statistical methods or machine learning or modeling to observability data. But we need a guideline, we need an understanding of how the results of those techniques should be used in order specifically to maximize collective trustworthiness in our alerting systems. We need to know that if we're using a model to generate alerts, that model represents some understanding of the underlying interconnected state and ontology of our systems. We need to ask ourselves, can the thresholds for this algorithm be adjusted? Is the model parameterized? Are the inputs and the outputs to that model human interpretable? These are all important questions to answer or to ask ourselves, because at the end of the day, alerts are there for us. They're there to do work for us. And if an alert fires and I look at that and say, oh, well, this is, it's above the threshold, so obviously that's why it fired, but it's not very far above, and I don't really know, how much does it actually really need to be? Is this a false positive? If you can't actually reason about the relationships between the inputs and the outputs in an appropriate way, then you're going to end up with a decision paralysis. That's going to be decision fatigue right there, and you're hosed. So what you need instead to be able to say, well, this alert fired, okay, and it is at at least 5% above this the threshold. So we understand why it's firing. We also know that we just doubled the number of containers that we're running in our cluster, and that will have this specific relationship between the inputs and the outputs. So in this particular case, that's actually a known entity, and it's safe to ignore this alert. You need a human to be able to reason through all the effects that those inputs are going to have, and that's not always possible with a lot of the modeling tools that are out there. Now, I'm not going to go too much into how these systems should be designed because, to be entirely honest, I wanted to keep this talk practical, and there are very few alerting systems that do anything like this. But if anyone's out there and thinking about designing alerting systems, this is a free idea, because I would love to see alerting systems that don't just leverage advanced statistical methods, but actually do so in a way that humans are able to interact with it and maximize the trustworthiness of their systems, to maximize the actual level of trust they have in it. The A in STAT stands for actionable. Ideally, when an alert fires, you should have only one decision that's required to respond to it, and that's the decision of whether or not to take action in the first place. Now, you can't eliminate that decision. A person always can either consciously or subconsciously decide to ignore it, but beyond that, everything does need to be fairly rote and not require any complex decision making or analysis. Because the more decisions that you have to make and the more difficult that those decisions are, the more likely you are to make a mistake at some point in the process. And in addition, the alerts that are difficult to action ultimately become the alerts that you ignore. Because if you go through the entire process of responding to alert and you find that, well, this one was it was a pain. It may not have even taken a long time, but just you feel drained at the end of it because you had to do a lot of thinking. Well, the next time you get paged for that, you're going to remember that. And you're going to feel fatigued even before you start. And you're going to be sloppy. You're going to make mistakes. You might even just decide to ignore it. And what's happening there is the decision fatigue has already depleted your resources, and it's trickling back up and generating alert fatigue for you. So we can't automate everything in our alerts, because if we did, then there wouldn't be a need to have an alert with a human involved in the first place. But we can bias towards making them more actionable. Go through your documentation, go through any runbooks or playbooks that you have for responding, and look for words that imply decision-making power. Things like investigate. Well, what does investigate mean? What are the data points that you're looking at? What's the actual metric? What are the thresholds? What are you making those decisions based off of? Saying like, talk to someone. Well, who's someone? Who are the, what's the class of people? What are the actual criteria there? Spell these out in your documentation. You don't have to do it in a linear fashion. In fact, a decision tree is oftentimes a more appropriate way to present this information. You can think of it like it's like a choose your own adventure book, except it's more like choose your own adventure of how to actually respond to this page. And you can have interactive tooling that actually even assists with this and does the decision making for you. It doesn't take the actions, but it at least tells you what, given these inputs, what the next step should be for you. Eventually, this tooling can serve as a way for us to encourage, well, here's where we can actually later automate things and eliminate these alerts altogether. There's one thing, though, that you remember about alerts and actionability. It's this. An alert can't be actionable without an actor. If there's any ambiguity of who is actually responsible for taking action, the alert is not fundamentally actionable. And this is a really common place for alerting systems to break down. Like one pattern that I oftentimes see is that you'll have alerts fire off into a shared place where everyone's sort of looking at collectively, like a Slack channel, for example. And the problem there is that it's really easy for me to look at an alert that's just fired in the channel and say, oh yeah, this is probably a problem, but like either Amy or Corey's probably going to take care of this. And then Amy's going to look at that and she'll be like, oh yeah, well I'm sure that Aditya or Kiran or someone looked at this already. And at no point in this process is anyone actually stepping up and taking responsibility for responding to it. If you've ever taken CPR training, you'll actually learn that this is something that they say that if ever someone goes into cardiac arrest and collapses, you don't just stand up and say like, okay, someone like, can anyone call 911? No, you say, okay, you right there, yes, you in the bluish teal plaid, yes, I'm pointing at you. You're responsible for calling 911 right now. And now he knows that that action is that responsibility is placed on him. And maybe his phone is dead. Maybe he doesn't have a phone. Maybe he needs to borrow it from someone. But everyone knows who's responsible for doing that. He can delegate it, and there's never any ambiguity about who's carrying that torch at any given point in time. The final step in our 4-step framework is triage. We need to make sure that our alerts reflect the underlying urgency and importance of the actual problem that they're triggering, and that the way that we're alerting people, the mechanism of the alert, reflects that as well. So an obvious dichotomy here is that if something requires immediate action, maybe we can page a person and interrupt them in their day. If it doesn't, if it can be responded to a few hours later, maybe we'll do that, handle that by sending it to an asynchronous, like a ticketing system. The key, though, is that this is actually the reason that healthcare in particular is struggling with alert fatigue. Even though they've been dealing with this problem for decades, and triaging is an age-old practice in medicine, what's happened is that as electronic systems have become more common, the ways in which they get alerted, the volume of data they're collecting, the types of alerts they're receiving has slowly increased. And in fact, in recent years actually exponentially increased. And so it's not that they don't know how to triage, it's that the ways in which they've been triaging, the levels that they've been assigning, have not necessarily kept pace with the changes in their systems. And so the urgency of alerts can actually change over time for us as well. 6 months from now, something that is worth paging today might not actually be worth paging. or vice versa. And that could just be because our traffic's grown, or it could be because our underlying architecture has changed. These are dynamic things that we need to keep, we need to keep up to date. The key for triaging is that everyone needs to understand what the levels and tiers are. There should be no, everyone needs to know that, yes, if something pages, this is what the SLA is, this is how quickly I need to respond to it, these are what the expectations are, and vice versa for things that don't page. And you might have multiple different tiers there depending on how complicated your on-call routine is. But everyone needs to understand that. There shouldn't be any ambiguity there. And you need to have a regular process. Put this on your calendar, like an actual regular interval at which you'll look at all the different ways in which alerts and pages can be generated, and reevaluate the tiers that you've assigned to your alerts. Because again, something that might be worth paging over today might not be 3 months from now. And you have to schedule this. You have to make it a conscious decision, because we can't actually trust ourselves on a day-to-day basis to notice the alerts that are actually bothering us and fatiguing us. Why is that? Well, because oftentimes the alerts that we've desensitized ourselves to and have started ignoring, they're actually the worst offenders. As we already saw, like those are the ones that are generating the most fatigue disproportionately to the number of, just the sheer number of alerts that they're causing. So the STAT framework, now that we have this 4-step system, we can actually apply this to the Prop 65 warnings and actually see, well, why is it that people criticize them for being not effective? Well, first of all, they're not supported in the sense that we're talking about. The people who are responding to all these alerts are anyone in the general public of the state of California, and they have basically no impact as individuals over what chemicals are worthy of posting those signs, or how those signs are worded, or the manner in which those alerts are generated. So they're not supported because the feedback loop is so weak. They're not trustworthy either, because aside from the fact that they're so ubiquitous that people have grown to ignore them, the actual list of chemicals that, that generates these alerts is quite controversial. Some of them are very obvious carcinogens, but some of them, the data is actually fairly weak as to whether or not they even are connected to cancer or to birth defects. And so people have learned that they might not actually be indicating something that's a problem. And they're also not actionable. Like if you see this, what's the action that you take at the restaurant? You don't know what the chemical even is. So you don't know how to avoid it. You just know that maybe it's something that's present in all the food, and you need to just avoid the restaurant entirely if you want to avoid the toxin. Or for all we know, this actually could be a sign that's just alerting us to the fact that, hey, this restaurant serves alcohol, and alcohol is a known carcinogen, so keep that in mind if you decide to drink alcohol. We have no way of knowing because, again, it doesn't give us enough and sufficient information. And they're not triaged because there's no sense of severity here. There's no indication of, well, all right, this is something which more than 30 minutes of exposure is deemed not to be safe, but under 30 minutes is fine, versus actually this is a really serious toxin. You really shouldn't be in this area at all without a mask or something like that. We have no way of knowing. There's no sense of the underlying urgency there. Now, STAT is a good mnemonic as an acronym because it works on a couple of levels. It reminds us what alerts really are. They're pieces of data, they're statistics, and they require immediate intervention, STAT. But it's not the end of the conversation. Again, it's a rapid diagnostic framework, and it's meant there to serve as the beginning, to help us generate and help us answer to help us generate the questions that we need to ask ourselves to identify and to work on improving our systems. We've learned a few things in this process. We've learned that alert fatigue and decision fatigue happen because they deplete executive function. Our executive functioning resources are limited, and that's why we get fatigued. And we've learned that because of that, we need to tackle alert fatigue and decision fatigue in tandem. We can't think of them as isolated problems. They're deeply and intricately linked. We've given ourselves a quick check, STAT, which we can use to evaluate alerting systems or individual alerts or individual aspects of our workflow and process to figure out if they are causing us fatigue. And we've learned that STAT, as a framework, it's not a one-and-done process. You can't just apply it once and then forget about it. We need to actually regularly and periodically, on a predictable schedule, evaluate our alerts, the sources of alerts, and other aspects of our alerting systems, so we can make sure that we're not falling subject to alert creep and decision creep the way that the healthcare industry is currently struggling with. Now, alert fatigue is a really complex problem. The healthcare industry has been struggling with it for decades, and that's why we're lucky, in fact, that there's been so much peer-reviewed published research into it, because it's such an important problem for them. So we might not be able to, in just one afternoon here at Monitorama, be able to find a silver bullet to solve all of our problems with our on-call schedules and our daily work, but by borrowing techniques and best practices, by learning from the research that's already been done in other industries, specifically in healthcare, by applying those techniques and figuring out where they might fit into our workflows as software engineers, we can make our on-call rotations and our daily work just a little bit smoother. Thank you.